Hey, welcome to another episode of the Get More Students podcast. I'm your co-host, Alex Asher, and CEO of LearnCube.
And I'm Herbert Gozer, founder of herbertgozer.com.
And today we are focused on something pretty fun, actually, the 7 do's of running marketing experiments. Now, this is not going to be an exclusive list, by the way. This is just 7 that we thought were really vital and essential for people to know. And also, I think it'll really help you in your business. And one of the reasons that we feel really interested in this particular subject and really excited to talk about this with you is that both Herbert and I are entrepreneurs. You know, we know the importance of running experiments because these experiments really help you reduce risk and really improve the effectiveness of what you do in your business. And also they're fun. They're the things that are the most creative and interesting as part of making a business.
Exactly.
And we do a lot of experiments in LearnCube. So LearnCube is what we do is we specialize in helping online language schools and particularly tutoring businesses to grow through our virtual classroom and online school. So obviously this is a startup in many ways, so experiments are very much a part of our DNA. But Herbert, you run lots of marketing experiments yourself.
Absolutely, every single day. In our ad agency, we manage ad accounts on behalf of language schools and education companies around the world. And I mean, for our clients, we're running experiments as to what audiences are working, what landing pages are working, what messaging, photos, videos are working. So we're doing tests all the time to continually optimize and improve our campaigns.
So this is definitely something that we're interested in. We're experimenting, I guess, with this podcast, in fact. So this is all about, learning and also in this particular case, we're trying to share those learnings with you. Because really there's no one way to do something. There's no one way when it comes to marketing. And actually sometimes the very thing you think will never work actually does.
Oh yes, experienced that many times before.
Herbert, how would you sort of explain this? Why are we experimenting in the first place?
Right. Basing your experiments on hypothesis and to see if it's going to work. A simple yes or no question. Will my will my hypothesis work? And as well as finding those initial opportunities out in the market, finding what sticks, what works, and then starting to optimize them a bit later. Also, you want to very quickly identify and stop expensive mistakes. So strategies that are losing money or are wasting money. Cash is king, so you want to preserve revenue as much as possible. And also finding opportunities that perhaps your competitors haven't found yet.
That's right. So marketing experiments, just like product experiments, and pretty much every part of business should be constantly creating experiments because we don't know everything. The market is changing and there are plenty more opportunities to uncover. And if you're not uncovering them, then probably your competitors are.
Yep.
Now, let's start off with our do's. Now, again, these 7 do's are not, they aren't gospel. But we had a lot of fun, and we found that this was the condensed version of really how to run experiments. And let's go through them very quickly, and then I'll go through each one. So the first one being, having a really balanced portfolio of experiments. Secondly, to know what metrics matter. Thirdly, to build, measure, and learn, and really following that lean methodology. 4, starting with a really wide net. Number 5, know when to fold them. 6, really keeping it cheap, but also getting enough data. And then also letting the data make decisions for you. So those are the 7 that we're going to cover in this podcast. So let's start off with number 1. And I actually, we had a bit of fun sort of talking about this first one because it was on having a balanced portfolio of experiments.
Right.
And we kind of got to it because, this is the same conversation that financial managers have about what's your portfolio of stocks, what's your portfolio of investments.
Exactly.
And experiments are like investments, right? That's why we run them, is because there could be really like small upside and then could be massive upside. And so you have a mix typically of very safe bets, some kind of moderate bets, and some really risky bets that have real upside. And I think that's the important one with whenever you're thinking about risky investments, make sure there's a big enough upside, because there's risky and dangerous with very little upside, and there's those that really can have a really strong upside. So yeah, have a little. I think that's one thing I would like to caveat on with that, because also you should think about this also in terms of risk of downside. So if you do something totally crazy, like even let's say something now that's like really on topic, something that's and we've seen it. I'm from New Zealand. We saw it with like a burger chain that was like slightly racist with their like menu options. Like that's risky, but I don't see there being high upside with that kind of idea, right? So, but that's just an example of like, hey, that is a marketing spin, but with probably much higher downside risk than upside risk.
Right. I mean, when it comes to say, our niche, Alex, language schools and tutoring companies, maybe a risky bet could be going into an unknown market, spending time and resources into exploring a new unfound region or market without knowing if it's going to pay off. And you might invest a lot of time and resources into that and not get anywhere. So I mean, it obviously depends on your company's risk appetite. There are many methodologies to that. Go big, go hard, or play it safe. It really depends.
But I think whatever kind of entrepreneur you are, or whatever kind of business leader, marketer you are, there is an aspect of, I guess you want to tip the odds in your favor, is probably my point. Right. And it's the same idea behind a portfolio of financial investments, as an example. Very rarely do you see everyone heaping 90% of their life savings into Bitcoin, unless you're right at the start of your life when you can afford to kind of make it up and over time. Exactly. But even still, like that's not something that anyone is really going to recommend. So typically, you're going to see your risky bets at maybe like 40% if you're pretty risky. But otherwise, you've got a bunch of moderate and safe experiments that you're still going to really want to run, because that's where you've probably got the highest chance. And actually, it reminds me of our previous episode, Herbert, on pick a niche, and we were talking about how do you pick a niche, and a lot of that comes down to how do you tip the odds in your favor. It's usually a market that a specialty that So those are what we kind of call sort of safe bets when it comes to marketing. You want to have enough of those, because there is a good chance that they will work. But try and also find some opportunities that maybe you didn't really realize were there. And as you say, Herbert, what are some of the ways that we could look at experiments? You talked about location. What are some other experiments when it comes to marketing that are kind of good categories for people to think about their experiments?
Right. You can experiment with different demographics. Experiment with channels, obviously, whether that be LinkedIn, TikTok, YouTube, etc. Experimenting with different messages and ways, angles to promote your offer. And landing pages, for example.
And like even copy, like video or short video GIFs or text, or mixture
memes, whatever that is.
So these are
experimenting with content.
There's not going to be a shortage of things for you to experiment, and I guess hopefully these next do's will help you figure out where to start. So number 2 we have are on know what metrics matter with your marketing experiments. So know what metrics matter. And again, this is something you're very familiar with, Herbert, because a lot of people might even come to you and your agency and be like, hey, look, I'm running ads and I'm getting lots of likes.
I've heard that so many times. And then I dig a little deeper. Right. So your ads got thousands of likes and so many new followers for your Facebook or Instagram page. And then I ask the question, so how many leads or how many enrollments or registrations or bookings did you get? And then they're like, oh, I actually don't know. Or they're like, one or two, or in some cases, zero. And so you've got to focus on the right metrics and know what metrics are important for your school, for your company. Stay away from those vanity metrics. I mean, they're a good way of measuring how your overall campaigns are going in terms of, are they getting views? Are people liking what you're putting out there? But at the end of the day, is it getting you the contact inquiries, the free trials, the conversions, paid customers? So looking at KPIs like your click-through rate, conversions, of course, maybe on LinkedIn, the number of started conversations or relationships and dialogue instead of just the number of connections you've been able to generate in a month. So yeah, those are some things to think about.
I really like that. And I think also when this really ties into when you're running experiments, to be very clear on one clear goal before you start it. Because otherwise, and the reason I say before you start it is otherwise it's really easy to get, oh, well, okay, let's look at likes though. I got 1,000 likes. It then can kind of get you into a validation trap. Whereas
Exactly.
before you start and you say, actually, I expect this is an ad that I believe should convert, then you should be really looking at what your conversion rates are. If you think it's something that is key to part of your process, let's say you're doing a multi-step approach and you're wanting, first of all, people to get to, let's say, a demo. Well, then, you need to have a clear goal of, if I spend this amount of money, I expect to get this many demos, because I might, and you'll need to know, because the number of demos might lead to sales. And so you're going to have a relationship with those. So number 2 was know what metrics matter. Number 3, now this is totally a copy and paste, and I want to really be clear about this. This is from the lean startup sort of methodology, which is build, measure, and learn. So it's really this idea of a cycle. And this idea of a cycle of experiments where the experiments never really finish. It's like I create the hypothesis, I build the experiment, I measure that experiment. That's why it's really important that you don't do experiments where you don't have a clear idea of how you're going to measure. Because otherwise, really, what sort of feedback can you rely on? And I think also the reason I say that is I've also made this mistake myself. Very easy to fall into the trap. Well, I spent a bit of money and I had some good conversations, that was probably good. And you kind of might put that into the learning bit, and it sort of is. But I would really encourage you to find ways that you can really measure whether that experiment worked or didn't.
Yeah.
And the more honest you can be around that, the stronger and faster those experiments are going to be. So definitely check out the Lean Startup if you haven't seen it. It's got some really great advice on whatever stage of business you are. If you're a very mature business, you should totally read it if you haven't already. If you're at the very start, you should totally read it, because it's going to be a very important part of your journey as an entrepreneur. The other things that it really talks about, do you want to actually mention any of your take on the Lean Startup?
Yeah, I mean, I think you just mentioned a really good point, Alex, about whether or not you're a mature business or a startup, because a lot of mature businesses sometimes forget about continuing to run experiments, because they've got their processes in place, they have their markets kind of all tied down, but they maybe have kind of closed the shutters, the windows to new opportunities and ways to innovate.
Yeah. I think anybody, and I just realized how guilty, well, actually, to be fair, we're trying a bunch of things, we're trying podcasts and webinars.
We are.
And YouTube, channels and playlists to kind of help provide content to. the folks that be interested in what we do. But I do think it would be very easy once we kind of run these experiments to go, great, had a good experiment session. Now, where do I allocate my budget? Okay, I'm just going to, put it on these 2 channels. And I think anyone, and as I say, I'm noticing this to myself, always keep some budget open for experiments.
Absolutely.
It's fun and it's really important because it allows you to see opportunities that probably competitors have missed.
Yeah, I agree.
So always have that. But number 3 was build, measure, learn, and really looking at lean methodology there. Now, number 4 was to start with a wide net. And tell us your experience with this, Herbert.
Right. I mean, at the very beginning of, I guess, any experiment, you want to keep things as broad and open as possible. I mean, for example, so something very specific when running ads. At the start, keep your target audience quite broad. I mean, one, because the algorithms are usually very sophisticated and are able to narrow in on your target audience anyway. But if you really narrow the net too early on, then you might be missing out on opportunities. So that comes down to audiences, that comes down to the platforms that you choose to advertise on or promote your services on. So don't make the mistake of narrowing your experiment too early.
Yeah, I think this also leads on to this idea of getting caught up with this idea, and actually it's when people are really going hard on these safe experiments, because they're not, after a while, they're not experiments. You're really just tweaking, making like minor changes. Let's say, and again, I just realized how guilty I was of this right now here, that in emails, you moderately change the subject line. Like, by keeping those 2 subject lines, I'm just using this as an example, really similar but changing one word, you might see fractional differences. What you're really looking for when you start experiments is just see if you can just hit some balls around and see what really goes, and really create some big contrasts and extremes in those early experiments. Of course, making sure that you've got enough budget to follow this up. You don't want to only have extreme experiments at every time, but the more extreme they are at the beginning, at least you're going to have some very big yeses and very big nos, which will really help you triangulate which marketing strategy is going to work for you. And I think the other, I just thought of an idea there, Herbert. I remember my parents getting onto Facebook, and they're sort of in their 70s now, and I was like, what are they doing? Like this the our place. And I just think of the people that were like, oh no, Facebook is only for, millennials or whatever it was at that particular moment. If they had kept that net really, really narrow, they would have missed out on all of those amazing, very well, a lot of elderly people, certainly in Western countries, often have a lot of money. So that's a pretty huge market. And a lot of people would have missed out on that by not having any experiments running with different demographics. So I think it's just an example I thought of where narrowing too early or narrowing forever and often get you into a bit of a blind spot. Number 5, we again had a bit of fun when we were thinking about it. It's really just know when to fold them. Know when to... No, and sorry, when I say this, it's not just retrospectively knowing when to finish your experiment. It's at the beginning. At the beginning, you want to set what is the time limit I'm having for this experiment, and what's the budget limit. So keeping time bound and budget bound, because without those at the beginning, it's going to be very easy to extend that experiment. And that might be stopping you from doing another experiment. So just realizing that there's always an opportunity cost when it comes to running experiments. And actually, it just reminds me of another thing that we were thinking of before, Herbert. I'm just wondering if we're going to talk about it later, but was this idea of there's small companies that are running experiments and seem to run lots of experiments. And then you've got
Yeah.
big companies that often run very few experiments. It's
Yeah.
actually the bigger the company, the more experiments you can run. It's not the
Well, they
opposite.
should be running it. Yeah.
Well,
They should have more resources, right?
yeah. But often you don't see that. Often you see the
Mm,
startups doing all of the experimentation when in fact they only have certain resources that they have at their disposal to even run them. But it's an interesting insight that actually, particularly if you're a mature business, you should really be thinking about experiments because if you have much more capacity to learn and to run experiments than even say a startup. So just something
yeah.
came into our conversation.
That's
But
true. I also feel that if you're under, time or resource pressure, then you have to come up with creative solutions, right? Whereas if you have an endless budget, then, it's not very pressing to find a creative solution. You'll just buy the solution.
that's it. So that just by creating constraints, you create creativity.
Exactly.
So know when to fold them, and I guess yeah, it's sort of that same idea, that idea of the casino, right?
Mm,
So
exactly.
go into a casino knowing what you're prepared to walk away
Yeah.
with.
With your
You
stop
definitely don't go
losses.
to a casino with a credit card and go, well, I'll just see if I'm lucky today.
Yeah.
Same sort of principle. Now, number 6 was, again, we had some really good discussions on this. It was number 6, keep it cheap, but also make sure you get enough data. So, Herbert, you've got some great feedback here because we were running it. We're like, is there a rule of thumb here? Because it's going to be really easy for people to think they're running lots of experiments, but really
Right.
not putting any money down or time into it, in which case they
Mm.
just don't get enough data to be able to conclusively say yes or no, which is what you really need initially from an experiment. Herbert, tell us your rules of thumb, maybe.
Absolutely. I mean, again, you want to keep it as cheap as possible and not spend a cent more than you need in order to get enough data to make a decision. Now, right, we really crunched the numbers when it came to this, and I had a look at some numbers from clients, and when it comes to converting, say, a cold lead. You're running cold traffic campaigns to running ads to people who have never heard about you before. A good conversion is anywhere from 0.5% to 1%. Again, this can vary quite wildly.
And this is particularly for education. So this is talking about
Correct.
tutoring and language. If you're trying to get language students or tutoring students, this is probably a bit of a baseline that you might be aware of or even observing in your own numbers.
Exactly. So then you also need to work backwards with those numbers. So if your conversion rate is 0.5% or to a percent, language schools and tutoring companies, from our experience, can get clicks for anywhere between 40 cents to $1. Again, depending on how expensive your course is. Which would mean that an experiment should cost anywhere from, say, $80 to $200 in order to generate an acquisition based on those numbers. Yeah, just with the just saying that your numbers might be different to that, and you need to find out what your acceptable cost per acquisition is, and then kind of work backward from that.
I think that's great. That's the lower end, by the way. So it could be
Mm,
$80, it could be 200 at the lower end. Uh,
mm,
Now again, you might have a maximum, but again, we were like, is there like a rule of thumb? And quite frankly, without knowing what your end price point is, it could be much, much higher than that. But there probably is going to be a range where you're like, you don't have enough budget to be able to run that many experiments. So I guess your budget then becomes the maximum. So if you've got a budget of $1,000, and you reckon that you can run an experiment at say $100, that means you've probably got $100 per experiment. So that's 10 experiments you can run.
Right.
And you're probably going to need experiments in a multi-level way. So for example, the first experiment might be just, a yes or no. Are they interested or are they not interested? And then you're going to need experiments going on from that to see, can you get that to a viable range? Because perhaps that first experiment is like, yeah, I can get them, but it's very expensive for me to get that first acquisition. But you feel some confidence that maybe another experiment might help you get to half that acquisition cost. So the point being is you'll need to look at your budget, figure out how many experiments you run, and then figure out what your risk profile is to be able to decide on, and also you've got to prioritize which experiments you think have the biggest upside as well compared to their risk.
Exactly. And you're always testing kind of one thing, whether that's the audience, the ad copy, the photo, the image, the landing page. And the idea of, running these experiments is to get better and better and better and know your customer even more so that you can bring down that cost per acquisition, bring up the click-through rate.
I think that was a really good point. That's the point we discussed before, which is knowing the metrics. But again, I think it was a really good point to reemphasize there, Herbert, being very clear on what your goal is.
Yeah.
But then it's also about, we thought of some easy ways to make it cheaper with your experiments. So one, just as an example, I've heard of, say, a tutoring company going, okay, I'm going to test a new website. I'm going to, get it professionally designed and then get it professionally made, custom for me. And it's probably going to cost me about $5,000 to $20,000 to get this website. That is not an experiment. That is an absolute hope for a home run, particularly when you put that in contrast to what's possible, which is using landing pages.
Exactly. You can whip up something within a day. It doesn't need to have everything on it, but you need to have an MVP, like a minimum viable product. That also applies to landing pages. Get that up, drive some traffic to it, and then see what the feedback is, see how people are going through your sales funnel, if they are interacting with your call to action.
And if they're jumping at they're just jumping for joy when they see your website and you're absolutely correct, then probably you're going to be totally happy to create that website. But just to be very clear that creating a website or redoing your website, if you're spending big money, is not an experiment. It's a position. We also, so you talked about being very clear on your testing, which definitely reduces the cost. So the clearer you are on what you're experimenting on with one thing at a time really helps your process of deciding whether the experiment is successful or not. And the other thing is just being very logical and sequential about it. So, rather than swing from one side to another and really not having any logic or process or strategy behind what you're testing, that can be very expensive with those experiments.
Exactly.
So our last point is to let the data make the decisions for you. So this is this idea of really detaching yourself from the outcome of your experiment, and really looking at the data. And again, this is your jam, Herbert. This is what you're looking at constantly, and also what your customers are looking at to judge performance. Tell me about your take on letting the data. Can we let data decide for us? I mean, people think about intuition, but what's your take on it?
Right. We always let the data make the decision for us. We have a hypothesis. We test different ad copy, audiences, images, and photos. We put it out into the marketplace, and then we see what is getting the most conversions, what has the best click-through rate, etc. And we base our decisions based on that hard data rather than being emotionally attached to, I don't know, this one video that we spent all this time creating, and, you know, it has our favorite student in it, and we're like, oh no, but we really want this to work. You know, that's a surefire way of spending a lot of money, on possibly something that, you know, doesn't resonate with your audience. So, you really want to use the numbers, black and white, to make decisions moving forward.
Yeah, I guess maybe I've got a couple of ways to help people think about this. And again, this is totally applying to me, so I'm not saying that I'm perfect at this and actually, oh, wow, I should be doing more of this. But the first one was when you're creating those experiments. First of all, I was talking about, you know, whether you've got intuition about whether it's working or not. Usually that intuition applies to trying it. But usually it's still, you should look at the data to say whether that intuition paid off. So
Exactly.
Intuition totally is relevant when you're like picking channels or making the experiments in the first place. But the data should tell you whether that experiment is working or not.
Right.
Again, one thing that I've heard and I know works, but I know I've not done this before, is this idea of trying to prove yourself wrong. So rather than saying, I know Google Ads works, I'm going to prove that Google Ads works, do the opposite. Go with the impression that I'm going to prove, so my hypothesis is that Google Ads doesn't work. And you might prove yourself right. Might prove, hey, it totally just doesn't work for what I've tried, and I should try something different. So that's one way of helping you detach yourself emotionally from that outcome. The other way was what we were just talking about before, by making your experiments sort of almost cheap and particularly at the beginning, disposable. Because if they're disposable, then you've got no vested interest in it, which is great if you're running a success, you know, because that helps you run a much more true and successful experiment.
Awesome.
So let's summarize with what we've actually covered today. So hopefully we've explained why it's so important to run experiments and how everybody should have at least some of their budget devoted to experiments. Now the 7 do's are to have a balanced portfolio of experiments, to know what metrics matter and having that one clear goal. Number 3, to build, measure and learn and really look at lean startup methodology. Number 4, start with a very wide net. Number 5, know when to fold them. Number 6, to keep it cheerful, but get enough data. And number 7, to let the data make the decisions for you.
Great.
So, Herbert, I've had a lot of fun with this. And also, look, thank you to our listeners for listening in. The goal of our podcast to get more students is really to give you those insights, some inspiration, some motivation for your marketing of your tutoring and language school. We release a new episode every week. So make sure you hit that subscribe button to the podcast so you can get a glossy new episode to your device each week. And we really have a lot of fun with this. So please give us your feedback. You can catch me at support@learncube.com, and you can catch Herbert
at herbertgoser.com. Looking forward to the next one, Alex.
Absolutely. See you then.
Bye.